Welcome to Pecan Baptist Church. Our vision and purpose is to love God, love others, introduce people to Jesus Christ, and watch them grow in the grace and knowledge of Him, helping them as they lead their friends and family to Christ. We pray that this message will bring you into a closer relationship with God and help you as you live the life He has given to you.
I invite you to turn with me this morning to James chapter 1. The epistle of James, written not by the apostle James, but by James, the brother of Jesus. Of all the trying things that you could ever be as a kid, can you imagine one more than that? Anybody here ever have a sibling? Anybody here ever be 100% sure that their sibling was better than them? I'm not just talking about what other people thought. I'm talking about what you knew internally. You knew good and well. Not only did everybody think your sibling was better than you, they were in fact right. Well, if that's you, welcome to a co-traveler, James, the brother of Jesus. He's that one that were you to try to tell him of your woes someday about your perfect sibling, he'd say, "Oh, give me a break. Can I tell you some stories? Sit down." So little wonder, the atheists, the unbelievers, the scientists, the lot, they think that they have a lot of questions that we're scared of. And I'm sure some believers are, but you need not be. Questions like, here's one of my favorites, and we'll talk about it a little bit today. If God is all-powerful, you ever notice these unbelievers, but they talk about him in that voice? What's with all the reverent voice if he doesn't exist? If God, so powerful, so wise and so kind and loving, they're just building it up, right? Here it comes. Here's the gotcha. Why do bad things happen to good people? They think that that's something we haven't been given any instruction about or any chance to think about. Well, the oldest book in the Bible, Job, all about that. That's the first question that's answered. But here's another that they like to bring up. Are you aware? They're going to teach you now about the Bible, right? Are you aware that even Jesus' own siblings did not believe in him? Which, during the period of his lifetime, and if they're more honest, some of them will throw that, during the period of his lifetime. That's true. We don't find James numbered among the believers. We don't find him at the foot of the cross. We don't find him any of those places. But here's a couple of things they don't necessarily want to quickly admit, but it's really fun to talk to them about if you find yourself talking to one of these guys. You get to say, yeah, I have heard that. Isn't it amazing what happened to change that? What are you referring to? Well, did you know that now, even in the most strict studies of ancient times, much to their chagrin, do you know what is no longer a controversial topic, even in places like Harvard, Yale, ancient history studies? Do you know what they've given up just in our lifetime that they used to struggle much more against? The factual evidence for the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Did you know it's a more well-documented historical fact than the fact that Alexander the Great ever lived? Did you know that the more they dig and the more they know it's true? And so most of them don't want to talk about it. They'll offer you no explanation for how it happened, but they won't argue with you that it is a historical fact in that time that it appears that a man named Jesus of Nazareth who lived, died, probably crucified, did. In that time, according to our best text, was resurrected from the dead and appeared to a great number of people. It does appear to be a historical fact. Well, one of the people he appeared to And I think rightfully so, in showing the justice of God. God said, hey, James, I know I kind of saddled you with a deal with that older half-brother of yours, so I'm really going to do you a solid. I'm going to have him come back face to face with you. After you've seen your mother, after you're 100% sure, after you've talked to other witnesses at the foot of the cross who know that he died, after you're sure that he was buried, you're about to hear some things about your brother, so I want you to hear it first directly from him. And so we're told that Jesus appears to Peter and then a few others, and then James before the other apostles. That's part of how we know it's not the apostle James, right? To his brother. And if you need much more testimony about who Jesus said he was, you now have the person who lived with him his entire life, had the best reason for a grudge ever, who then becomes arguably the early, most staunch defender of the faith, leader at the Church of Jerusalem, pastor at the Church of Jerusalem, writer of the first epistle of the New Testament. Before Paul picked up pen, he had penned this epistle we're about to dive into. And for over 30 years, pastored that early church. He comes to his demise. Lesser history, the one that I think is less credible, says in AD 62 he was stoned. And he may have been, but we know that Paul survived that. That wasn't always a death sentence, depending on how it was carried about. So I don't really have an opinion as to whether he was or wasn't potentially stoned in 62. But better history tells us in AD 69, James was invited by the Sanhedrin. Now remember, these are still deadly, very dangerous people. By this point, they had figured out that they were never going to do away with this idea of Jesus and who he said he was, and this Christian thing wasn't going away. It wasn't just going to be bullied down, dealt with that way. And so in Jerusalem, during a very busy time, they tell James that they want him to speak to the assembled audience, as big as they can assemble, and they would like him to acknowledge that his brother was a great teacher, an important member of the Jewish faith, and to do away with some of this divide. In other words, help us hold on to our power. But you need to explain to them, James, that this idea that he's supernatural and this resurrection thing, and, that there was any divide between us back at the crucifixion, we want you to do away with those rumors for us. Will you speak? Well, James recognized this was not so much an invitation as an order. So they take him to the assembled crowd. They put him not just on the steps of the temple, but the top. They ask him to address the assembled audience, and so he does. Paul says of a preacher, we ought to be ready in season, out of season, right? Well, what do you think James does? He begins to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ to the assembled crowd. They throw him off the top of the temple, meaning to kill him. He hits, he doesn't die. So they do stone him. There for sure. He doesn't die. Finally, we're told, there is a man there, a fuller, dyes garments, makes cloth. He has a club in his hand, and he clubs him to death. And that's how James, the brother of Jesus, dies, preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so here, when he goes to introduce himself in chapter 1, verse 1, he says, James, a servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ. Sometimes we're given a chance to introduce ourselves. We want to be careful what we say. To the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greeting. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations. So what he literally says here, in a very concise way, he says, guys, I want to tell you when you ought to get really, really happy. What you ought to consider a happy circumstance. I want to come to you and tell you about an opportunity you're missing. And that's to find joy in the various temptations. In other words, when things go wrong, when you find your life not turning out as it should, or as you thought it should, or hoped it would. Have you ever had a day like that? Not just a day like that. Let me ask you this. Have you ever had a day when things did not seem to be going well, and you could not figure out for the life of you what it was you were contributing that was causing things not to go well? I'm talking about a bad day when you've worked really hard for things to be good. This is the kind of thing like when you've spent years building a business and it fails, and you find yourself standing at the foot of a bankruptcy court, looking at people who are looking at you saying, gee, what happened? Why didn't you try hard? Whatever. And you know you put absolutely everything into it. I'm talking about a day where maybe you're standing in a divorce court and you're hearing a judge proclaim that a marriage is over, that you poured everything into, that you were a good and faithful spouse and you worked hard, and the marriage failed anyway. I'm talking about when you've labored with a loved one who's in bad health and you've done everything you could to save them, and they died anyway. Talking about when you've waited years as a couple to get pregnant, and then the child, either mom miscarries or the child's born and then in birth dies, or as a young child runs out in the street and is hit by a car. Those kind of bad days. I'm not talking about flat tire. You ever had a day like that? Talking about the kind of day that David might go back and tell you about, where I having him here on the witness stand to talk to, and I say, David, did you ever have a day like that? He say, hey, I'll tell you about one. Yeah, I'll tell you. Just as a reminder, I'm a kid, I'm out with my sheep, along comes Samuel, nobody even thinks of me. Samuel goes through all my brothers twice, says, dude, you got any other sons? Kinda. I mean, David's out with the sheep, but if you don't like this lot, trust me, you can look for him. He comes in, Samuel says, that's my guy, he's going to be king. They say, okay, congratulations, now back to the sheep. I go back out. All that happens is, my brothers are mildly to moderately irritated with me, and I am a student at that point of Old Testament history, so I've heard of a guy named Joseph. I know how that worked out for him when everybody said he's the special one and the brothers got irritated. So I'm happy to be out with the sheep, right? Then one day, Dad finally says, hey, I've thought of one useful thing other than sheep you can do. Take your brother's lunch. They're in battle. He's like, I'm all about it. I want to see battle. I show up, no battle. Loudmouth over there talking on behalf of the Philistines. I'm like, hey, why don't you guys whip him? They're like, why don't you? He's like, I'm game. Game on. Let's do it. They're like, we were kidding. I'm not. Where do you think they got that from Tombstone? Did you know Tombstone borrowed from the Old Testament in that moment? I don't know either, but hey, it fit, didn't it? That worked. David steps out, comes back with the head of a giant in his hand. Now, not only has he been anointed king, He's this legendary warrior. Saul moves him in, makes him a captain, then becomes jealous of him, tries to kill him over and over and over and over again. David finally flees to get out of the conflict, has 2 opportunities to kill Saul, won't do it. Why? Because of his belief in God's sovereignty, God's hand, he's not going to move. So he finally leaves and goes to the land of the Philistines when he makes one of his biggest mistakes and says, there's nothing better for me. The last thing we ever want to do on one of our bad days, by the way, is assume that just because that thing's happening means anything's over. But David does. He says, look, there's nothing better for me. Saul's never going to give up. He's never going to die. I'm going to flee over the land of Philistines, and I'm just going to serve them. He goes over there, and then what happens? Well, he gets stabbed in the back. After faithfully serving them, he goes up to go to battle with them. They say, hey, we don't want you. In the meantime, while he and his men are gone to this battle that they're kicked out of, guess what happens? Somebody raids their town, kidnaps all their wives and children, steals everything they own, burns everything down. So he gets back, and how's that for a bad day? After years of trying to faithfully serve God, he sits in the burned ruins of Ziklag, and his friends are assembled around him, and what does he hear them saying? I think we ought to kill this dude. He is the worst leader I've ever seen. How could he let this happen? Let's kill him. Do you remember what rescues him from this Ziklag experience? A guy named Abiathar, a priest. Why is Abiathar even with him? Because in what David feels like was one of his earlier mistakes, he got an entire city of priests killed, except one, Abiathar. Who comes to him? When Abiathar flees from Nob, he takes with him the ephod, the way in which they communicated with or sought God. David, sitting there in that burned heap, says, Abiathar, bring me the ephod. He gets quiet. He turns to the Word. The Word leads him to pursue their wives and children. On the way to find their wives and children, there's a starved-to-death Egyptian in the desert where he doesn't belong. They stop. They nurse him to health and say, how did you get way out here? And he said, man, I was with a raiding party. We raided here, we raided there, we raided there, and then we raided Ziklag and burned it down. And David said, do tell. Do you know where we might find these guys? He said, hey, don't kill me and don't give me back. I'll take you to their front porch. David says, deal. They recover everything. What's the point of that? What's the point of the Ziklag experience? The point is that the trying of our faith, all of these bad things, sometimes later assemble to be the very thing that saves everything. And it's in that mindset, maybe, that James wrote, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations. Knowing this, knowing, ginoskos in the Greek, it means to know or to come to know absolutely. We have to be careful what we say we know, shouldn't we? We're way too loose with that phrase. Don't you agree? People who stand up, there's no limit to the number of people who are willing to tell you more about a subject than they really know. Here, James, that's not the kind of knowing he's talking about here. He's talking about the kind of knowing that you only get through life experience. He's saying, tell me about Ziklag after you've lived through Ziklag. Knowing this, that kind of knowing, he says, knowing this, that the trying, dokimion, that which, the way that you prove something, the proving. So know by experience that the proving of your faith, pistis, that's the conviction of the truth of anything, but especially respecting man's relationship to God and divine things with the included idea of trust. Greek was very precise language, beautiful language. It's no wonder that God chose it to be the language of the New Testament. And it's no wonder that he spent all this time making sure that James was up to the task, because of where they lived and where they did business. James was bilingual, and one of the two languages was Greek, and his epistle is written beautifully in the Greek. So what's he saying? He said, look, know by experience that the trying of your faith, in other words, what you think about your relationship to God. Wow, there's a lot packed in that, isn't there? First of all, it's who I'm in this relationship with. Who is God? Well, that goes back to Job. That's what that whole question was about. He's the guy that they think they're talking about, but know nothing about. God. We have to decide what we really believe about him. Is he so scary and judgmental that he can't even be approached? Is he, as more churches seem to believe today, so loose and laissez-faire, the most lenient parent ever, and whatever you do is groovy and cool and it don't matter? Who is he? What do we know about his nature? We have to decide, much like Jesus. Ask Peter, who do you say that I am? Right? Well, in this trying of our faith, the most important question probably about God is he just? Is he fair? Because I'm talking about a Ziklag experience, right? I'm talking about a bad thing happening to me that I feel like I did everything to avoid and I couldn't avoid. This is that Joseph experience of his whole life, right? I didn't ask for my father's favoritism. I didn't ask for my brother's hatred. I didn't ask to be kidnapped. I didn't ask to be turned into a slave. I didn't ask then to be falsely convicted and turned into a prisoner. And yet I find myself here. That's got to cause you to ask, well, what do I believe about God? If he's in control of everything, how did I wind up here? You ever have one of those days? I have. Job, do you remember, famously had one. The Bible begins the book of Job by telling us he did nothing wrong, despite all the theologians who now want to try to explain that away. Well, he had to have contributed some way. No. Starts the book by telling us he did nothing wrong. And yet, all of these calamities fell on him. And throughout it, he said, I'm just going to keep trusting God, using this idea, faith. So I'm going to have faith. I'm going to trust God for the outcome. And that's where we miss it so often, isn't it? It's when we become, as people, we are so obsessed with outcomes. That's what we seek to control. So often we waste our prayer life on it. Praying for outcomes. This is what I need. I need this outcome. Yet the first thing that faith asks us to give up is our quest for outcomes. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. But knowing this, that the trying of your faith, that belief that we have in the relationship with God, in our relationship with God, when we're tried, in other words, about the character of God. Do we believe that God is just and that he rules the world in a just way? Do we believe that whatever is happening in my life is the right thing to be happening now? Am I able to accept what the Apostle Paul put this way? All things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. Let's define faith that way, okay? That the trying of your faith, in other words, when that comes into question, it works patience. What's that word patience? Hupomene in the Greek. That's the characteristic of a person who's not swerved from his deliberate purpose and loyalty to faith, even by the greatest trials. So James said, know this, when something bad happens, here's what's happening. It's happening in our lives so that we can be fashioned more unswervable. You want to know the most damaging thing that happens during bad times in our lives? It's when it causes us to step away from our faith. Not completely. I'm not talking about denying God, but I'm talking about doubting His goodness, doubting His sovereignty, doubting His power. We don't like to think that we do that, but we do, don't we? When we question that point where we're at. When I look around at Ziklag and say, man, if God's good, how did this happen? When I look around at that calamity in my life and say, God, where were you in that? Rather than looking around and recognizing He's right here. God is in the heavens. He's done whatever He's pleased. His ways are above my ways. His thoughts are above my thoughts. And so what does this mean? It means everything has to work out from here. I don't have to like it. I don't have to understand it. But if I'm really going to have faith, I do have to at least accept that principle. That somehow it works out from here, that this is something working together for good. He says, the trying of my faith works patience. It makes me more difficult to swerve. And if I'll let patience have her perfect or complete work, then I'll be entire, wanting nothing. That word perfect, telos, nothing necessary to completeness. It's not the way we often use it now, to be without flaw. There's a certain element of that in there, but it's really about complete. And when we look back to the life of Jesus, we're told by the writer of Hebrews that it pleased God, even with Jesus, to make Him complete through the things that He suffered. So it ought to be no surprise to the believer that bad things are going to happen and that they ought not shake our faith. They're the very thing that strengthens our faith. They're the very thing that demonstrates, when they ultimately work out, that God is exactly who He says He is and that He is in control. And so somehow, despite how unsatisfactory it is at times, the answer to why do bad things happen to good people is answered this way. It's a flawed premise. First of all, we have to ask ourselves, who am I to even say what is a good or bad thing? You ever been there? Did you ever beg God to get into something and then get into it and it almost destroy you? Turns out to be the worst thing that could have ever happened. And we were so anxious to get there. And I'm not suggesting God put you there because you asked. No, that's completely different than what I'm saying. But I'm talking about our desire to be there. I want that outcome, God. We get it, and we find out it was a horrible outcome. On the other hand, have you ever prayed, oh God, don't let this happen, oh God, don't let this happen, and it happens? Turns out to turn your entire life around with the best things that ever happened to you. Well, that life experience, that knowing through experience, then begins to teach us, doesn't it? That one of the things maybe we ought to dispose of in the whole thing is this idea of a good thing or a bad thing. It serves us better often as believers to say, I don't have the perspective to know whether this is good or bad. So I'm going to trust God that it's necessary, whether it's good or bad, and I suppose we will see ultimately, right? And in this difficulty, what does he say we do? He says, well, if you lack wisdom, Sophia, the knowledge to live that way, to trust God as Job did through hardship. He said, well, ask of God. But ask in faith. We already know what that is. Nothing wavering. I've become obsessed with that. Because it doesn't really point where I had always kind of felt like it did. James is here espousing a faith, and I'm about to close. That's as far as we're going to make it today. He's espousing a faith. I'm going to invite you to think about this with me. If I don't have the perspective that God does to know in my life what is a good or a bad thing, a necessary thing or not, and I've decided I'm going to trust Him entirely, and if I'm going to do that, and if I'm going to have peace in my life, James will talk about that a couple of verses down, rest, how do you get that? He says this is the Christian that's able to have peace. This is the Christian that's able to have rest. He says it's going to be this guy. You know, Paul talks about learning whatsoever state he's in, therewith to be content. Do you remember him saying that? I've been up, I've been down, I've just learned, hey, whatever it is, to be content. James almost takes that idea even a little farther. And what he says is, all right, let me lay one more little predicate. Let's say, for the sake of today and for you guys getting to lunch, faith is this. Faith is learning to trust God for the outcome. I'm going to leave the outcome with God. I'm going to do the obedient thing. I'm going to do what's right. I'm going to work hard, but I'm going to trust God for the outcome. I'm going to stop being obsessed with outcomes, because that's what we spend our life doing, right? I've got to control this outcome. I'm praying for an outcome. I need a specific thing. Well, instead of becoming so obsessed with that, I'm going to become obsessed with being obedient to Him, just doing the next right thing I can do in the situation, doing the next thing the Bible instructs me to do, and I'm just going to trust Him for the outcome. Well, I would present that could take a lifetime to learn to do, I think. James actually talks here about doing one better. And when I first saw this kind of blew my mind. When James says, if you need something from God, if you need the ability to live this way more, that's the wisdom he's talking about, then ask in faith. Now, what's that faith? Trusting God, trusting God's character, nothing wavering. That word wavering, underlying in the Greek there is this thought. He's not talking about not doubting God, because, you know, in those moments, that would be almost a supernatural ask. I mean, isn't that true? If we're in a moment where I'm having doubt, then to tell me I've got to trust God without doubt, that dooms me. Right? If you put that predicate on it, what the idea that he's really communicating, he said, we need to learn to ask God without a preference for what the answer is going to be. Now, I want to ask you what that would do to our prayer life if we learn to pray like that. Father, I'm beaten down. Father, I'm confused. Father, I'm hurting. This is the worst day I recall in my life. I can't see you here. I don't know how any good can come of this. I'm looking at the burned ruins of my life. Everything that I've worked for to this moment in my life is gone. I've already been obedient. I've already done everything I know to do. That's what got me here. And I need to know what to do next, and I don't know. And James says in that moment, you know, if we can ask in faith, in other words, trusting the person we're asking, without even so much as a preference for what he says to do next, that's what allows us to have peace. Now, I'm not suggesting I've learned to do that. Nope. With the things most dear to me, I still have extreme preference for how I'd like them to work out. I still feel very involved, committed to certain things that I can't stand the thought. I can't even speak about if they were to go wrong. I can't imagine how I would feel or what I would do. And then again, I can, and that's what makes me terrified. But if I'm being more honest, when I think of those things, I also have to stand and tell you, life has finally brought me to a place where I recognize I don't have any control over those things. I don't know what will enter my life tomorrow. I don't know what will happen to me or someone I love dearly. I don't have that perspective. I don't know. And that's the very reason James says, that's exactly right, Roger, you can't know that. But you know God. You know He's good. You know He's in control. You know that all things are working together for good. So that leads us to what Paul wrote, right? Paul said, you know what? I've suffered the loss of all things. I now count it nothing. I gained superior experience, and what that superior experience told me is that God is exactly who He said He is. He'll do exactly what He said He'll do. And that I don't have to be worried about it. I don't have to fear, because He's already there and He's already worked it out.
Thank you for listening today. If you'd like to learn more about the ministries of Pecan Baptist Church, go to our website at www.pecan.church or call 682-205-1565. We're located in Granbury, Texas. Services are each Sunday at 10 a.m.